Being a machine gunner in Vietnam meant carrying the heaviest burden in the squad, and not just because your weapon weighed 23 pounds. You were the most valuable asset your unit had, and the enemy knew it. That made you the primary target in every ambush, and if you were lucky enough to survive, you carried the weight of what you did for the rest of your life. We're going to show you what being a machine gunner actually did to the men behind the gun, what it did to the enemy on the receiving end, and why this role produced some of the most intense combat experiences of the entire war. When the United States began deploying ground troops to Vietnam in 1965, the military brought with it a weapon that had been perfected through decades of warfare. The M60 machine gun, nicknamed the Pig by the men who carried it, was a belt-fed, air-cooled weapon capable of firing 550 rounds per minute. It was derived from German designs captured after the Second World War, combining elements of the MG42 and FG42. On paper, it was among the finest general-purpose machine guns ever made. In practice, it would become the defining weapon of the Vietnam War, and the men who carried it would experience combat unlike anything their fathers had known. The machine gunner's position in a rifle squad was both privileged and cursed. You were the base of fire, the one everyone else maneuvered around. When contact was made, you were expected to suppress the enemy while your squad flanked. That meant you fired first, you fired longest, and you drew the most attention. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army understood American tactics perfectly. They knew that killing the machine gunner degraded the squad's firepower by more than half. So in every ambush, the gunner was target number one. This wasn't speculation. Captured enemy documents confirmed it repeatedly. NVA training manuals specifically instructed soldiers to identify and eliminate the machine gunner before engaging other targets. They taught their men to recognize the distinctive silhouette, the way the gunner moved differently under the weight, the assistant gunner walking nearby carrying extra ammunition. Some units even trained soldiers to listen for the M60's distinctive report, a slower, deeper sound than the M16, so they could locate and engage the gunner by sound alone. The life expectancy statistics that circulated among troops were grim. 7 seconds in a firefight, some said. Others claimed the average gunner lasted 2 weeks in the bush. These numbers were almost certainly exaggerated, the kind of dark folklore that spreads through any war. But they reflected a psychological truth that every machine gunner understood. You were marked. To understand what these men experienced, you have to understand the weapon itself. The M60 weighed 23 pounds, unloaded. Add a 100-round belt of ammunition, and you were carrying nearly 30 pounds before you even counted the spare barrel, cleaning kit, or the additional belts your assistant gunner and ammo bearers hauled. In the humid jungles of Vietnam, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees and humidity hovered near saturation, this weight became punishing. Gunners burned through thousands of calories daily just moving with their squads. The standard load for a machine gun team was 800 to 1,000 rounds, but in practice, everyone in the squad carried extra belts for the gun. An M16 rifleman might carry 20 magazines. But if the machine gun ran dry, the whole squad's firepower collapsed. So grunts stuffed belts into their rucksacks, draped them over their shoulders, did whatever was necessary to keep the gun fed. The machine gunner wasn't just carrying his own weapon, he was carrying the squad's survival. The physical toll was obvious, but there was something else that set machine gunners apart. The nature of their killing was different. A rifleman fired at individual targets, squeezing off rounds at shapes in the tree line. A machine gunner worked in volume. When you opened up with an M60, you weren't shooting at a person. You were suppressing an area, walking tracers across a position, saturating a kill zone. The results were devastating in ways that rifle fire simply wasn't. The M60 fired the 7.62x5 1mm NATO round, the same caliber used by the M14 rifle, but delivered at a rate that turned single impacts into continuous trauma. At close range in the jungle, which was where most Vietnam firefights occurred, the effect was catastrophic. Bodies didn't just fall, they came apart. Veterans described things we cannot repeat here, and most never spoke of what they saw at all. But before we go further into what this weapon did, we need to talk about where these gunners came from and how they were chosen, because unlike snipers who were selected for patience and precision, machine gunners were often selected for one simple reason: they were big enough to carry the gun. The official criteria for becoming an M60 gunner emphasized physical strength and stamina. Squad leaders looked at incoming replacements and made quick assessments. If you were large, if you looked like you could hump the pig through the bush without collapsing, you might find yourself assigned to the gun whether you wanted it or not. Some men volunteered, drawn by the firepower and the respect the position commanded. Others were simply told this was their job now. Training varied wildly. Some gunners went through extensive courses at Fort Benning or in-country training facilities where they learned the M60's quirks, its tendency to jam if not kept obsessively clean, its habit of running away if the sear wore down, and its need for barrel changes every 200 rounds of sustained fire. Other men received their training in the field, handed a gun by a rotating veteran who gave them maybe an hour of instruction before climbing aboard a helicopter home. The M60 was not a forgiving weapon. It was prone to malfunctions that could get you killed if you didn't know how to clear them instantly. The feed tray cover could pop open during firing. The operating rod could break. The gas system fouled in the jungle humidity, and stoppages became constant if you didn't clean the weapon religiously. Veterans learned to carry extra parts, especially the operating rod and the bolt, because field stripping an M60 during a firefight while rounds cracked overhead was a nightmare no one wanted to repeat. There's one specific malfunction we have to discuss because it defined so much of the M60 experience. The weapon could go runaway, meaning it would continue firing even after you released the trigger. This happened when the sear, the component that held the bolt back between shots, wore down from heat and use. Once it started, the gun wouldn't stop until you broke the belt, burned through all your ammunition, or managed to tear the belt free from the feed tray. In a firefight, with adrenaline flooding your system and enemies trying to kill you, dealing with a runaway gun was terrifying. Now that you understand the weapon and the men who carried it, we can talk about what actually happened when these guns were used in combat. And there is no better place to start than the Ladrang Valley in November 1965, the first major battle between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, and a demonstration of just how essential machine gunners would become. When the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Air, assaulted into Landing Zone X-Ray, they had no idea they were landing almost on top of a North Vietnamese division preparing to attack a nearby Special Forces camp. Within hours, roughly 400 Americans found themselves surrounded by an estimated 2,000 NVA regulars who had no intention of letting them leave. The battle that followed was sustained. Close-range combat of an intensity American soldiers hadn't experienced since the Pacific War. NVA troops attacked in waves, sometimes getting close enough to throw grenades into American positions. And in this chaos, the M60 crews became the difference between survival and annihilation. At one point on the perimeter, a single M60 crew held a section of the line against repeated human wave assaults. The gunner, whose name is recorded in official accounts, fired until his barrel glowed red and had to be changed. He burned through barrel after barrel, his assistant feeding belt after belt, until the gun literally began to fall apart from sustained fire. When it finally jammed beyond immediate repair, he picked up an M16 from a fallen soldier and kept fighting. But the Ladrang also showed the terrible cost machine gunners paid. Of the men who died in those 3 days of fighting, a disproportionate number were gunners and assistant gunners. The NVA had studied American tactics, and they knew exactly how to hurt a squad. Kill the gun, then kill everyone else. The pattern would repeat for the next 8 years. What made Vietnam different from previous wars was the nature of the combat itself. There were no front lines, no trenches to hold, no clearly defined enemy territory. American units conducted search and destroy operations, humping through the jungle looking for an enemy who chose when and where to fight. And when the enemy chose to fight, it was almost always an ambush. The standard NVA ambush was a killing zone covered by interlocking fire, with the machine gunner identified and targeted in the first seconds. American doctrine called for the ambushed unit to assault directly into the ambush, overwhelming the enemy position before they could exploit their initial advantage. This meant the machine gunner had to be firing immediately, suppressing the enemy while his squad mates assaulted. If the gunner went down in that first burst, the assault often died with him. This is why assistant gunners became crucial. The A gunner carried extra barrels, extra ammunition, and was trained to take over the gun instantly if the primary gunner was hit. In many squads, every man knew at least the basics of running the M60, because the gun had to keep firing no matter who was behind it. The psychological weight of this responsibility was immense. Machine gunners knew they were keeping their friends alive with every burst. They also knew they were primary targets. This combination produced a particular kind of combat stress that manifested in ways unique to the role. Many gunners reported a strange dissociation during firefights. The gun became an extension of their body. The recoil, the sound, the brass flying from the ejection port, all of it faded into a kind of trance state, where nothing existed except the tracers reaching toward the enemy and the belts feeding through the gun. Time distorted. Firefights that lasted minutes felt like hours. Engagements that stretched for hours compressed into fragmentary memories. And then there was what happened when the firing stopped. Unlike a rifleman who might never know if his rounds hit anyone, machine gunners often saw exactly what their weapons did. When an area was suppressed and the squad swept through, the gunner walked past his own handiwork. The 7.62 round at close range was not merciful. Bodies bore wounds that defied description. And the gunner knew with absolute certainty that he had done this. We need to talk now about specific actions, because the Vietnam War produced machine gunner stories that deserve to be remembered, even though the men themselves often refused to speak of them. At the Battle of Dak Tu in November 1967, Army units assaulted Hill 875 against entrenched NVA positions. The fighting was so intense that at one point a machine gun crew found themselves completely alone, their squad killed or wounded around them, holding a section of the perimeter against repeated assaults. The gunner, a 19-year-old from the Midwest, fired until his barrel warped from heat. When his assistant was killed, he fed his own belts with one hand while firing with the other. When ammunition ran low, he collected belts from the dead. He held that position for 6 hours until reinforcements reached him. He never spoke publicly about what happened. At the siege of Khe Sanh in 1968, Marine machine gunners faced something different. Sustained, daily bombardment by NVA artillery, combined with probing attacks that could materialize from the fog at any moment. The gunners lived in bunkers, their weapons pointed at the wire, waiting for the ground assault that intelligence said was coming. Some of them manned their positions for weeks without relief, sleeping in shifts beside their guns, jumping to full alert at every sound. The assault never came in the numbers predicted, but the waiting nearly broke some of them. The Tet Offensive of 1968 changed everything. When NVA and Viet Cong forces attacked simultaneously across South Vietnam, American units found themselves in urban combat for the first time. The battle for Hue City became a month-long nightmare of house-to-house fighting, where machine gunners had to adapt tactics designed for jungle warfare to the streets of an ancient city. In urban combat, the M60's characteristics became both asset and liability. The weapon's penetrating power could shoot through walls, allowing gunners to engage enemies in adjacent buildings. But the long barrel and bipod made the gun awkward in confined spaces. Gunners learned to fire from the hip, bracing the weapon against their bodies, spraying hallways and courtyards in ways that doctrine never anticipated. The fighting in Hue produced some of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. Machine gun crews were rotated constantly as men were killed or wounded. By the time the city was secured, some companies had gone through their entire complement of trained gunners and were putting anyone who could carry the weapon behind it. There's something we have to address about the machine gunner's role that remains deeply uncomfortable to discuss. The weapon's purpose was to kill in volume, and in a war where distinguishing combatants from civilians was often impossible, the M60 was used in ways that still haunt the men who pulled the trigger. Free fire zones, areas where anyone present was presumed hostile, existed throughout South Vietnam. In these zones, machine gunners opened up on anything that moved. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were suppressed with machine gun fire before ground troops entered. Sampans on rivers were engaged on suspicion alone. The rules of engagement, already murky, often disappeared entirely in the chaos of contact. Many gunners came home carrying memories they couldn't share with anyone. The reflexive firing at movement in the tree line that turned out to be a farmer. The sustained bursts into a village that silenced everything inside. The bodies found afterward that weren't soldiers. These experiences produced guilt that lasted lifetimes and contributed to rates of post-traumatic stress among Vietnam veterans that exceeded any previous American war. We also need to talk about the enemy machine gunners, because the NVA and Viet Cong had their own automatic weapons, and the duels between opposing crews became some of the most intense combat of the war. The Soviet-designed RPD and later the RPK were lighter than the M60, easier to carry through the jungle, and remarkably reliable. NVA machine gunners used them differently than Americans, often in fixed positions covering likely approach routes, or as the base of L-shaped ambushes designed to trap American units in kill zones. When American and NVA machine guns engaged each other, the firefight became a duel of tracers, each crew trying to suppress or kill the other before their own position was overrun. American gunners learned to watch for the distinctive muzzle flash of enemy automatic weapons. Engaging the enemy machine gun became priority even before engaging infantry, because that gun could kill more of your friends than any number of riflemen. The counter-battery duels between machine gun crews produced some of the most skilled and deadly gunners of the war, men who developed an almost supernatural ability to locate and destroy enemy positions. The losses among these men were staggering. No comprehensive statistics exist for machine gunner casualties specifically, but unit histories suggest they died at rates far exceeding their proportion of the force. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, in one 6-month period, lost so many machine gunners that the position became informally known as the dead man's slot. Replacements arriving in-country heard these stories and understood what they were walking into. Now we need to talk about what happened to these men when they came home, because the war didn't end when they left Vietnam. Machine gunners returned to a country that didn't want to hear what they'd done. The anti-war movement was at its peak, and veterans were sometimes confronted, spat upon, or simply ignored. For men who had spent months carrying the heaviest burden in their squads, keeping their friends alive with firepower that haunted their dreams, this reception was devastating. Many never spoke of their service. They put away their uniforms, tried to forget the weight of the gun in their hands, tried not to flinch at sudden sounds that resembled the M60's distinctive rhythm. Some succeeded in building normal lives, others didn't. The rates of PTSD among Vietnam veterans generally exceeded 30% by some estimates, and anecdotal evidence suggests rates among machine gunners were even higher. The weapon's effects on the human body were difficult to unsee. The responsibility for keeping squad mates alive created guilt when anyone died. The knowledge that you had killed in volume, that your weapon had done things to human bodies that couldn't be described in polite company, produced a particular kind of moral injury that therapy was only beginning to understand. One veteran, a machine gunner with the 25th Infantry Division, described it this way in an oral history recorded decades later. The M16 guys, they could tell themselves maybe they missed, maybe it was someone else's round. I couldn't do that. When I opened up on a position and we swept through afterward, I knew exactly what I'd done. I knew who did that. It was me. Many gunners destroyed their photographs, threw away their medals, refused to attend reunions. Others went the opposite direction, becoming obsessed with the war, reading everything they could find, trying to make sense of what they'd experienced. Some joined veteran support groups where they could finally talk to men who understood. Others drank themselves to death, never speaking a word of it. The M60 machine gun remained in service until the 1990s, when it was gradually replaced by the M240. But for a generation of American soldiers, the pig defined their war. It was the heaviest burden and the greatest responsibility. It was the sound of survival and the instrument of nightmares. And the men who carried it, who fed it, who kept it firing when everything depended on that gun, came home carrying wounds that no one could see. The Vietnam War produced no definitive machine gunner memoirs, no famous accounts like those of snipers and fighter pilots. The men who served behind the M60 rarely sought recognition for what they did. Perhaps they didn't want to remember. Perhaps they couldn't explain it to anyone who wasn't there. Perhaps the weight they carried was simply too heavy to ever fully set down. But their contribution was immeasurable. In ambush after ambush, firefight after firefight, the machine gun was the difference between a squad that survived and a squad that didn't. The men who carried that weight, who made themselves targets to keep their friends alive, who bore the psychological burden of killing in volume, deserved to be remembered, not celebrated necessarily. War isn't something to celebrate, but remembered.